Hey everyone, I want to go ahead and talk this week a little bit about communication ideas that are presented in our text. And then I'll also be posting a brief printed lecture in the module as well. So hopefully some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about will actually be starting to sound almost repetitive at this point. The Cormier communication chapter should, for you, have helped to put together and provide some context for some of the smaller bites we've been taking throughout the semester in terms of information about the importance of communication. So let's go ahead and see just what I'm talking about. So thinking in terms of this week's readings and in terms of our previous readings and lectures, what actually makes helping relationships work? What factors actually influence outcomes? Is it specific techniques or specific theoretical orientations? Not so much, right? It's the relationship itself that actually contributes the most to positive change. This is what we see throughout the literature and empirical research. And what do relationships hinge on? Well, relationships hinge on communication, right? And furthermore, it makes sense that it would be the client's perception of the relationship that's most important. So how exactly do good communication skills make such a fundamental contribution to the therapeutic relationship? Well, they help us establish rapport. Effective communication allows us to develop empathy. Effective communication conveys that we're coming from a non-judgmental, accepting place. It helps us to convey genuineness. And in turn, it helps us to convey respect, an open-minded attitude, our patience for listening to clients, and an overall sense of warmth. Importantly, we want to ensure that we conduct our communication with an awareness of the subjectivity of our perspective and mindfulness of the distinction between our personal feelings and our objective conceptualizations of whatever situations the client is presenting. Try to think about it in terms framed by our discussion of the role of values and the importance of being aware of our values. Our discussions previously on those topics. We also want to use communication as a tool to help convey a shared expectation for a positive therapeutic outcome. We want to help generate the sense within ourselves and within the client that positive change is not only possible, but that. So what does this mean? How does this happen? Well, hypothetically or on paper, it's really not very complicated. There are specific behaviors that you could almost call techniques that we want to implement throughout our verbal communication with our clients. We want to respond to clients most often with short, simple verbal responses, just kind of nudging them along sort of responses. And we want to paraphrase what clients say to us so that they have the sense that we understand what they're saying. We want to reflect their feelings back to them through our own affect and expressions, and then also verbally. We want to keep the whole thing rolling by asking interested, thoughtfully conceived, open-ended questions. So when we look at these verbal behaviors or techniques as kind of a whole package, what we see is the counselor in a role that's kind of encouraging, right? Gently sort of coaxing the client's story out of them. You see a treatment environment where clients aren't going to feel that they're being judged, and they are going to want to share. That's going to feel like the most natural thing to do. And this sharing, this information that clients provide, well, it gives you the information that you need to keep the therapy moving, but then at the same time, it is the therapy itself. So let me say that again. The communication is the therapy itself. It is hugely therapeutic. So this idea of the relationship as the actual therapy is really explicit in Rogers, right? So that's why we viewed his video, his movie, a little bit ahead of his actual module, the module that we're going to do on person-centered counseling. As you watch Rogers' work, I think you can see where he's operating from a perspective where the interaction, the communication, the relationship, well, that's the therapy. So non-verbally, we want to maintain eye contact with the clients, a comfortable level of eye contact. So we're not talking about, if you guys remember the old Conan O'Brien skit with the stare down, like the staring contest. We're not talking about that. We don't want to laser focus on people's eyes and freak them out. But we do want to be checking in regularly and maintaining a comfortable sense of eye contact. We want to maintain a relaxed, open posture. We want to face the client and lean slightly towards them as they're speaking. So just like with the verbal communication techniques or verbal ways of being, we see that in the nonverbal behaviors, we're gently coaxing information and processing of stories, of client stories, gently coaxing those things out of the client that we're working with. We want the verbal and the nonverbal communication to contribute to an environment where the client feels comfortable sharing, where the client wants to talk and doesn't feel judged, and feels that sharing their story is the most natural thing for them to do. So while we're implementing the ideas about communication and behavior, while we're implementing, I guess I should say, these behaviors related to communication, we also want to ensure that the communication, the conversation, is purposeful so that it's headed in the direction that it needs to head. Now, I almost said so that it's headed in the direction that we want it to go in, but that's not actually right. It's more accurate to say that you're infusing the conversation with intentional direction that's going to help achieve the goals of the therapy. So this is a pretty tough line to walk, right? You want the conversation to be purposeful, you want it to have a sense of direction, and you want to help folks structure their stories so there's a beginning and a middle and an end. And then at the same time, we want this process to feel natural and comfortable. It's a fine line to walk. On one end of the line, there's this really kind of letting go and laying back and rapping with folks and letting conversation go where it's going to go. And then at the other end of the line, there's this really controlled kind of interview type approach to counseling. We want to avoid either one of those extremes. We need the communication to have purpose, but we want it to feel open and natural as well. So that's what I'm talking about when I said a few minutes ago that hypothetically, on paper, is pretty simple. In practice, it can be a little more complicated. So as we go through counseling sessions, maintaining this purposeful yet open conversation where we're helping people structure their stories to have a beginning and a middle and an end, we also have another agenda. Now, I don't mean a secret agenda where we're tricking the client, not like the old movie version of psychology where the doctor knows what's going on and the patient doesn't. No, I actually mean just having a list of reasons operating in our mind for the things that we're doing while we're communicating. As we're summarizing and interpreting and clarifying, gently probing and very gently confronting, especially when we're just starting out. We want to be really gentle on this confronting portion. Our agenda has two big pieces. And I hinted at this a moment ago. We're trying to get more information so that we know what's going to happen and we can move the counseling forward towards the identified goals. And then the other piece is that we want clients to tell their story for themselves so that they can understand. So in this context, when we talk about helping folks to understand, it's important to think in terms of helping the client understand their story, which is different from making the client understand their story in terms that we're going to lay out. Our role is not to define their story for them, but to help them be able to define for themselves. And all the while that we're doing this, we want to be building empathy, conveying a non-judgmental attitude, fostering a sense of acceptance, conveying genuine respect, warmth, patience, and open-mindedness, and really creating an environment where a positive view of human nature is palpable. So again, why are we doing this? I know that I'm repeating myself, but that's okay. We do it because it's essential to professionalism. You just think of a professional interaction, and certainly these things fit in line with that. But more importantly, the communication is how the therapy itself happens. It's how counseling happens. A wealth of research tells us that relationships built on these elements of communication make effective therapy happen. These relationship-based factors are consistently common to good therapy. The therapeutic relationship is the primary key contributor to making the whole deal work. More than any specific technique or theory, it's these common factors that make it work. Now, Rogers knew this and developed a whole approach to counseling based just on these common relationship-based factors. So again, the relationship is what makes it happen, and communication is what makes the relationship happen. So in this context, take a minute to think back about the Rogers and Gloria session and what worked within that session. What communication techniques did Rogers implement that seemed to work? How did he actually move the relationship forward? What are some specific things he did that you can actually see? Like, wow, it looks like this is really doing something. I suppose in a broader context, it's also worth, you could do this sometime, obviously, when you're not listening to the lecture, but you can think about what he did that maybe didn't work. Are there any examples of his communication where maybe the tone of the relationship stalls? I think that would be an interesting exercise to see also what didn't work. Certainly that's going to be maybe the rare moment, especially with Rogers, but definitely worth considering. So I know I'm definitely repeating myself from previous weeks, but I do think this idea is really at the center of the foundational way that we want to think of what good counseling looks like. We know from research that 70% of outcome variance, so 70% of the difference between counseling outcomes is due to factors that are common to all types of therapy. These common factors, these communication, relationship-oriented factors, the positive aspects of the therapeutic relationship that exist in all models. And what this represents is a working alliance in which clients sense that they're being listened to by someone who empathizes with their situation and is not judging them. So these elements influence outcome way more than specific technique or theoretical orientation. And in line with that, counseling effectiveness is more strongly associated with individual therapists than with specific interventions. So if you have a counselor who's good in one theoretical approach, that counselor is also likely to be good in another theoretical approach. You're unlikely to have a situation where a counselor does a horrible job at like motivational interviewing and then does fantastically in cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, what this suggests is that these fundamental communication skills that we use to build the therapeutic relationship, irrespective of what theory we're operating in, it's these fundamental skills that make good therapy happen. And again, definitely more impactful than specific treatment modalities. So we can think about this in terms of Rogers. We can think about this in terms of the Cormier chapter, and actually the previous chapters that we've looked at as well. Research strongly suggests that Rogers was right, that it is the necessary conditions of empathy, non-judgmental attitude, and on down the line that make therapy work. And how do we operationalize these necessary conditions? Through communication. So wrapping up here by focusing back on those elements that characterize effective communication. Good communication hinges on behaviors that are geared towards facilitating summarizing, interpreting, clarifying, and on down the line. And really, even more specifically, good communication is geared towards creating a space for clients to summarize, interpret, and clarify, etc. The counselor plays an active role in the process, obviously, but we're not trying to bring brand new ideas into the dynamic that have no genesis in the client. We want to be summarizing what the clients share in a way that they understand and makes sense to them. Confronting, we want to be thinking about this as a very gentle activity, especially at the beginning of our counseling careers. And we'll talk specifically about confronting when you all are here during the on-campus week. And we definitely want to think about the idea of confrontation a little differently than how we think about it sort of conversationally out in the world most of the time. That is, we want to think about it differently in the context of counseling. So for now, let's think in terms of what we really want to do is to gain more information so that we know what's happening and to help guide the therapy. We want to help clients to get their story out for themselves so that they can see it, so that they can think about it, and they can consider their thoughts, statements, and actions in a context that makes sense for them. Thanks for listening, everybody. Take care. We'll talk soon.